Good afternoon. My name is Joe Schmidt. I'm the Social Studies Specialist for the Maine Department of Education. Previous to this position, I was the K-12 Social Studies teacher leader for Social Studies curriculum in Madison Metropolitan School District in Madison, Wisconsin. I was a classroom teacher for 9 years. I currently serve as the chairperson of the NCSS Government and Public Relations Committee. I co-chair the NCSS Task Force on Advocacy. I co-chaired the NCSS Summer Leadership Institute during the summer of 2020. I serve on the NCSS Task Force on Inquiry, and I also work on the Civics Educator Network, as well as a past participant of the Teaching Tolerance Advisory Network as well. So that's a little bit about me. Today we are here to talk about a republic, if we can keep it. This is about democracy is noisy, civil discourse and controversial topics in the classroom. So we're going to talk about the importance of addressing these controversial topics in your classroom and not avoiding them. The objectives for this series for today is to get a little uncomfortable, discuss why these discussions are important, look at what experts suggest, and then learn about resources that are available. Are you ready to get started? The first thing I want you to do is take a moment and look at this piece. It's a review of a medical board. There are 5 patients. They are 5 people who suffer from a rare and to this point incurable disease. The quality of their life is profoundly affected, which makes day-to-day responsibilities very difficult. The doctors have finally come up with the only medicine that can cure it. However, right now they only have enough to help 1 person. If you had to choose, which of the following people would you designate as the recipient? So I'm going to go ahead and give you a moment here to take a look at the 5 patients: male aged 23, female aged 15, male aged 36, male aged 42, and female aged 56. You can read a brief little description about them, and I want you to come to a decision about which one of these patients you would give the life-saving medicine to. So I'm going to go ahead and give you about 30 seconds to continue to read through that, and then be ready to think about and be ready to explain which one of the patients you would do. So go ahead. Your 30 seconds begins now. You have 10 more seconds. Three, 2, 1. If I was doing this with a live group, obviously I would A, give more time for you to think about these pieces. And then B, the next step is I would put you into small groups of probably 3, 4, or 5, depending on the size of the group, and have you share with your group who you decided and why. The key indicating piece being the why to it. Too often we are more than happy to share our opinion on something, but we're not very clearly able to articulate the why into how we got to that decision. So again, thinking about the decision that you made, would you be able to explain to somebody else why you picked the one of those 5 participants that you did? So I'm just going to give you about 20 seconds to think about what is your why. How would you explain that to somebody? Five seconds. So now if you were in a live setting or a live webinar setting, again, in your group, I would be asking you to share your vote with everybody and then seeing if your group could reach a consensus. And if the group could reach a consensus, what was the rationale for who you selected? What's the why? If you could not reach a consensus, I would want you to discuss what were the disagreements or where did the tension lie in all of this? And then as an educator, thinking about the next step out of that. So if you were to do that with the classroom, could you see your own students having troubles accepting a final answer for this question? And what would you do to support this type of question or this type of discussion? Because again, looking at this setting, there is no right answer, right? Any of those 5 could be viable yes answers to why you would select them. So it is kind of controversial in that idea, or at least tough in the idea that we're probably not going to get 100% agreement or consensus on that. There's probably going to be a split in this. And students, when making a decision, are probably going to have some sort of emotional response to that, because we are talking about life and death. What I like about this activity is it's not a kind of quote unquote real world piece out there that a lot of educators at this time are hesitant to tackle or discuss for fear of implications about what might happen as a result of these disagreements. So I do think that this is important for students to engage in this type of question. And this is a nice example of a way that you can do that. And then at the end of the discussion is over, right? Because this isn't something then they're going to see in the news or hear in family discussions or community discussions. So it's a nice way to introduce them to this. Because if we're looking at the work of Dr. Diana Hess, who's currently the Dean of Education at the University of Wisconsin, her book, Controversy in the Classroom, from I think it's around 2006, 2007, she's got this great quote on page 6 that I always like to kind of summarize as the idea that this idea of controversy in the classroom is a responsibility of schools to help students have these type of conversations in a safe, structured environment. And if we are declining to engage in these, because they are understandably tough, they are controversial topics for a reason. But if we're not engaging in it for a variety of different reasons, I like to say that we are abdicating that responsibility as educators in a school districts. And then we have to understand when students aren't given the opportunity to practice this in a safe, structured classroom environment, what does that mean for them moving forward outside of our classrooms, in our communities, whether that's in face-to-face engagement or whether that's in the current world of social media. And I think a lot of people that I've worked with and talked with on this can see some of those connections, and that there are some struggles when it comes to people in general, but then young adults as well, struggling to engage, again, especially in social media, where people who are disagreeing with them. We hear oftentimes about the echo chamber of social media. So I do think it's a real big responsibility of education and educators to make sure students are exposed to multiple and conflicting points of view that are different from their own. In fact, one of the big things that I will share with educators when talking about why we need to do this and when they're getting pushback is I say, okay, one thing you can tell your administrators, if your administrators are not comfortable with you doing this type of work, is that it does actually raise test scores. So Kay Gishwama-Ginsburg, who currently works at the Circle Institute at Tufts University, she took all the 2010 NAEP data, and by 2013, she processed it and released out the information that in all of the indicators that she was looking for, the only one that she could find that increased test scores across every single socioeconomic status, gender, race, etc., was how often students debated. And students who debated more than once a month had higher test scores. So that's one tool I give to educators when thinking about that they may not be getting administrative support. That simple reason is, we don't want to upset the community, we don't want angry parents, which, that's understandable. So obviously we don't, but we also can't avoid it because there is academic strength that are tied to students who do engage in these type of debates. So if you do want your students, if you want to cut it right down to that piece, students who debate more often do score higher on tests. And so that's the data that we have supporting that. One thing teachers will say, well, am I allowed to do this? And yes, teachers are allowed to engage in controversial discussions. The role of a district is to set some of those boundaries and pieces in that. And what teachers have to make sure they're not doing is trying to deliver their district curriculum or state curriculum in an attempt to indoctrinate students. They can't let their own personal beliefs interfere with the obligation of delivering this curriculum. So if a school district curriculum says you must be teaching X, Y, Z, it doesn't matter as an educator if you necessarily agree with those things. You do have to bring those pieces in. And you also can offer that deeply slanted view where you're making sure that you're trying to inculcate students into a certain way of thinking about the topics. But both of these do not have any sort of restrictions in terms of actually engaging in this controversial work. The district can, again, set some of those boundary pieces where they can look at it and say, well, we want you to talk about this or not talk about this, or teach it in this manner or not teach about this manner. But what you have to worry about as an educator is making sure that the line you don't want to cross is, if you're talking about one of these topics, the goal for you can't be to convince students of one side or the other. If that's what your intent is in trying to deliver this type of work, then you are probably crossing this line in here. Now, if your intent is to have a reasoned, educated discussion where both sides are heard and able to share these things, again, and I prefer in that safe, structured environment, then you are absolutely, unless the district has purposefully blocked you from talking about a certain topic, then you are not going, falling in, you are not blocking or crossing any lines in terms of that. So just because a topic is controversial does not mean that it's automatically going to be getting you in trouble. Again, that line to be thinking about is the intent to have students discuss both sides of a topic, or is the intent you're trying to deliver so that they hear your opinion, or that you're hoping to convince them of a certain opinion? And the idea, because when we're bringing in this type of curriculum, what we are really doing, to quoting John F. Kennedy, right, that this ability to engage in civility is not a sign of weakness. It's a sign of strength to be able to hear both sides and to be willing to let both sides come into that. And one of the things I really stress is that we have to make sure when we're having students engage in this work, that it is not just a straight talking back and forth period, right? I think what we've seen a lot of times, you know, the stereotype is the cable news network where you have the talking heads kind of yelling at each other, is to make sure that if I'm thinking about standards work in this, that there's speaking and listening components to it. That listening is not a passive part of this learning experience. We absolutely want them to speak, but when they're listening, they should be making sure they're making eye contact with the person they're listening to, or at least looking in their direction, that they should be giving them their undivided attention, that they should be actually hearing and thinking about the words that are being said, and that they're not just waiting for an opportunity to talk again. So there's a lot of things that I will do with this where before students are able to speak or respond, the very first thing that they have to do is, what I heard you say was, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So again, that focus starting off is that they were actually listening to the previous speaker. And then if we can get that confirmation, then yes, then they're allowed to go ahead and speak. Because that's just one of those things, again, if we're actually going to engage in a civil discourse, we have to be listening. There's two parts to it. It's not both sides talking, but it's both sides talking and listening. And listening, again, is not passive. And so one of the ways that I really promote doing this is some of the new work. I talked about Controversy in the Classroom by Dr. Diana Hess. Her follow-up book, The Political Classroom, was the National Council of Social Studies. She was the 2017 Researcher of the Year from a lot of work in this. She co-wrote it with Paula McAvoy, who at the time was at the University of Wisconsin and is now at North Carolina State. And the idea of this book is, should we be talking about politics in the classroom, right? It was that more specific topic addressing controversy, quote unquote, in the classroom. They talked about the political classroom. And so they've got some resources here where you're looking at the controversial issues, how to talk about it. What do you do when you have the polarized classroom? They've got a brand new website up that talks about the political classroom and some of those resources. But what I really want to focus on, where their work has really focused on, is the structured academic controversy. And the structured academic controversy, I think, has a couple big key components to it. And the big one is structured, right? And this is what I tell educators all the time, that you don't want to just jump in immediately to the highest, most controversial topics. Find ways, even if you want to build towards some of them, even if you're in an older grade level, right? You can still have them debate things like chocolate versus vanilla. What's the better ice cream flavor? Elementary kids, have them debate chocolate versus vanilla. Have them debate and discuss the idea of what makes a better pet, a cat or a dog, right? I mean, there's going to be people who have opinions, and even strong opinions on both sides of those. And it's the ability to disagree in that piece. Not about winning, but it's about bringing information to the forefront. So that's the first thing I would recommend is regardless of what grade level you're at and what age those kids are at, don't just immediately jump into extremely controversial topics. You have to build some of those classroom norms and classroom expectations first, and then work up to some of those other structures. And again, the reason I love the structured academic controversy is because some of those key structures. And so one of the big things of it is that you will be bringing in the information that students would be using in the discussion. So you can say, okay, we're going to talk about dogs versus cats as the better pets. And I'm going to bring in these 3 articles that say it's dogs and these 3 articles that say it's cats. And that's what you're going to have students working from. So it's not something they may have heard, not something they may have found online. We're starting to structure by making sure we're working from these key pieces. And what I do with that is I'm going to always want students, anytime they're referencing something or talking about something, I tell them they're going to want to make sure that they can point at it. So if they're referencing a specific quote or idea from one of those readings, they should point at it. They should be able to hold up and say, right here, this is what I'm talking about. That keeps them focused on that information that was brought to that table. And that's one of those ways you can make sure that if you're looking at those controversial pieces, that we're at least keeping it in specific realms, right? We're not letting it go into, some of the toughest things when it comes to difficult debates are the slippery slope arguments. Well, if we do that, then it's going to become right. And you can turn those into a whole lot of different things. But by keeping it in these certain little areas, we can still have those very tough topics and those tough conversations, but you're structuring out that piece. And you're also structuring out the time and how students engage with one another. So we might say okay, puppies, you're going to go first. You're going to say, yes, having a puppy is the best pet you can have. And you're going to give us 2 minutes to give us why, right? So then for 2 minutes, that's when they're referencing those documents. They're going to say, well, the reason's because here's everything I've come up with. And during that time, the people who have been assigned the cats side, I normally do like groups of 4. 2 would be for puppies, 2 would be for cats. They're going to be listening and taking notes, because when the 2 minutes is up, the first thing that the cats group is going to do is respond, what I heard you say was, and they're going to give that 30-second synopsis overview of what they heard. And then it's up to the dogs people to say, yep, that's pretty accurate, right? There is that opportunity to say, well, that's not what we meant, or you misheard us. But hopefully that idea is we've talked for 2 minutes about these facts and this information. We've heard you. Here's our summary in 30 seconds. And yes, you heard us correctly. Then you come back in with now the cats having 2 minutes, right? So we're keeping that same structure. They're going to give their facts, stuff that they can point to. And then we're going to have the dog side say, well, what I heard you say was, again, for 30 seconds. And you do time it. I just use my timer on my phone. 2 minutes is up, beep, 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 time. That's it. End the conversation. It's that structured piece that keeps them in line. It's timed. They've been given clear resources to work from, and they're listening to respond and summarize. You can do a second round if there's still more facts to be done, a second round, a third round. You don't have to allow them to get in the rebuttal piece. That's one of the big things. When the cats are just giving their first idea about why cats are better, it's not a rebuttal. It's not a you said this, but it's back to still the information that they had. But you can do 2 rounds, 3 rounds, and then say, okay, now we're going to do a rebuttal. Now go ahead using the information, respond to directly what they're saying, right? So now you're giving those pieces in place. And then if you feel comfortable, again, those structures in place, you can have a last round where it's just like, okay, now it's just an open discussion. How do you really feel? What are you really thinking about this? So students are going to be looking through that information. And so that's a good piece created by David and Roger Johnson called the Structured Academic Controversy that have really been elevated by Diana Hess and Paula McAvoy as part of their Political Classroom series. And you can see I have the links there. That's one when I do the Structured Academic Controversy as part of full day workshop professional development, we talk about, was Abraham Lincoln a racist? So it's raised a little bit of that uncomfortableness because people are like, oh, I don't know, that doesn't seem like something we want to talk about, but it's pretty still low key, old stuff. And you look through speeches and stuff he had written at different points in his career. And what are the different things that he is saying about enslaved populations and or African Americans? And so you look through that and then you go ahead and work to build out the arguments. And then again, there's primary documents for both sides. I do out graphic organizers to help them keep track of here's what I'm going to say in my first 2 minutes. Here's where I'm going to take notes where they're talking. Here's my summary, right? And so we're walking them through. And really what it is the idea of bringing your clear set of facts to the table as part of the discussion. The goal is for not to me to zing you, not to one-up you, not to out-talk you or over-yell you or anything like that. It's bringing the facts to the table in that structured environment, making sure that both sides are being heard. And there's websites out there where you can pull some of this together. So ProCon.org is one, talking about LGBTQ equality, legalization of marijuana, gun rights, death penalty, immigration, healthcare for all, right? So there's your pros, and you could pull that information for students. I mean, if you have older students, I mean, you can go ahead and have them bring stuff in, but again, you're starting to lose some of that structured piece because you're not quite sure what they may bring in. So I'm not saying you absolutely cannot do it without allowing students to bring in some of the stuff, just aware that you're adding more variables to the piece. When it comes to politics, I like to direct people to use iCivics. And again, as noted in my brief little introduction, I have served on the iCivics advisory board for 6 years now. I used it in my classroom with juniors and seniors before I was part of that advisory board. But what I like about it is the idea you can cut to talking about how the systems work, and it's not necessarily specific to any piece. So in this example, you see California is a heavily Republican state. It is truly a randomized function of the game when you look at some of these pieces. I've completely won using both sides. This game here is called Win the White House. It's one of my favorites. I'm pretty sure I'm undefeated when I come to going against my students. And I'll take any side to do it, right? Because it's not slanted in. It's a completely randomized piece. And so it starts to take those pieces out about, well, is this a Republican or just a Democrat? No, it's just about those simple base processes. So sometimes you can get to those controversial pieces by first laying the key foundational pieces that should not be controversial. So students, before you let them completely run off into some of the controversy, make sure they have the basic functions and understanding and knowing of it. And so I've just highlighted here, if you're using iCivics, right, there's games you can play, have them play. There's lesson plans and stuff that you can work from and teach. You can create a free account. You can go in. You can have your students assign them different games. They talk about how long the game takes, talks about what it's meant to be covering. So here it's talking about a campaign, how counties work, what's the day in the life of the president, that type of stuff. So sometimes the controversy can kind of be worked through by making sure that you're eliminating some of those really polarizing pieces, right? Well, I'm afraid to talk politics. Well, we can still cover some of those basic foundational pieces of civics and government and not get into those deep political pieces that might sidetrack. And once you get that foundation, then you can have some of those other conversations. And there are other places that have resources. Social Studies School Services, they have a blog article, 7 tips for tackling controversial topics in social studies. The New York Times has 10 ways to encourage civil classroom conversation. Discovery Education has civil discourse in the classroom, right? So there are resources out there. There are tips and tricks and ideas and stuff out there. And I encourage you to go ahead and look through, because I don't think it's the avoiding the controversy that we should be focusing on. It's making sure that you're prepared to have those discussions in your classroom. And for me, that big part is I would keep encouraging you to know what the topic is, know the key ideas the students are going to talk about, and then making sure the structures are in place to have those conversations in a safe learning environment. We don't want it to just break down into yelling. We want to make sure that the things students are talking about are appropriate. And when you do have these type of conversations, there is the opportunity for it to not always go well, right? But we have to make sure to understand that when we do open up these conversations, that when we have issues, they are opportunities for learning. And so Teaching Tolerance has a series called Speak Up at School, where it's preparing you to think about how to respond to everyday prejudice, bias, and stereotypes. So if we're talking about a different topic or a different controversial topic, and somebody uses a stereotype or uses something like that, are you prepared to make sure that becomes a learning situation for not only that student, but all the students in the classroom? Because those things are going to come up, but you have to be ready to address them. So Teaching Tolerance talks about, making sure you're advanced. If I'm talking about a certain topic, what are the type of things that might come up? There's things in here where you can practice with other people. okay, if I'm having this discussion and a student says X, I'm going to respond by, right, making sure, just like anything else, the more you practice it, the more you think about it in advance, the more ready you're going to be to actually tackle it in that moment. And make sure that when those things do come up, you've put all the structures in place the best you can, but something still didn't work out the way you'd want it to, right? An inappropriate comment was said or something come up, you do have to address it in that moment. So we take that advanced work to address it in that moment and thinking about the different location. The location of where this happens matter, right? Like, because I talked about, I did a lot of debates in my classrooms, and I told my students, mostly seniors in a sociology class where I did a lot of debates, is that this is the environment we're going to have these places. And that if I heard of these discussions leaving the classroom, out in the hallway, out in the cafeteria where we didn't have appropriate structures in place, then we would probably have to discontinue the discussions. And the students were great about it, right? They understood that piece. So there was things that were said in that classroom, in the structured, in the environment piece, knowing the context of it, that is different than in the hallway, right? Because that's what I told them. If you go out and say, this student said X, that's really easy to take out of context. Do they understand? Were they assigned the yes or no side of something? Were they reading a quote from a writing, right? So the location does matter. So when you're prepping and thinking about what to say in the moment, you can prep in different ways. How am I going to address it if a kid goes too far in my classroom in the middle of a discussion? But also, am I ready if there is that spillover, if I hear something else, a student saying something else in another environment, how do I approach that? What do I say? Because when we're going to give the opportunity to have these difficult discussions, we are opening up these opportunities for these conversations. And again, we want to make sure that students understand how to talk about them in a safe space, and that making mistakes will happen, and that's okay. And as educators, we'll make mistakes on that as well. And our goal is to just minimize them and be prepared by understanding and thinking it through again. What resources are we using? What's the structure we're going to use? Preparing in advance to think about how am I going to keep track of this as best I can. And so one of those things you'll probably want to build in is classroom environment pieces, classroom contracts. What are the rules? Do the students know the rules in this? I have, and I think it's listed later on in the presentation. One of the things I talked about in getting my master's degree is some of the work of Dr. Barbara Coloroso, who does this great chart about the difference between teasing and bullying, right? People are like, oh, I'm just teasing. They say that all the time. But she talks about like these different balance inequities of structure and power in bullying, right? My friends and I, as my peers, may tease each other one back and forth, but you have to be in a peer group for it to be teasing. If you're not ever teasing me back, that's an imbalance. That's just bullying. That's just me bullying you. It's not a back and forth piece. And so thinking about what are the classroom rules? Do students understand the structures in place? Are they on board? Do they know what will happen if they go too far with something? Do they understand how to apologize to you, to a student, to the classroom? Do they have the opportunities and know, right, they're not just going to jump into a conversation. We're going to do a writing piece. We're going to give time for silent reflection, to give opportunity for people to gather their thoughts. Because some people need that extra processing time, right? So whatever those classroom things are in place, do students know them and understand them? The Morningside Center for Teaching Social Responsibility, they've got this list and lesson plans that go along with it, right? How do you create this safe environment? What do you need to do? How do you support the students? So whatever you decide to do with these and bring them in, just make sure like you've got that component in place. I'm not saying that the Facing History and Ourselves one is any better than the Morningside Center one. Whichever one works better for you, or modify it based on what you would need. I would just say make sure that you have some of those structures in place. Again, day one, think about community. Day two, build on that community. Day three, puppies versus kittens. What's the better pet? That's starting you down the path to have some of those really tough conversations, right? You're setting up those safe environments. You're practicing it at a beginner level to begin with, and then working your way up. And make sure that you have the students involved in the creation of this. You're going to want to hold them accountable to it. So they should also have a voice in creating that, that contract. And, you know, one of the things I always talked about in my classroom was helping them to challenge the idea, not the person. And there's the link to the teasing versus bullying piece that I referenced earlier. But how the students, okay, so then how do we do that? Right? Because if you're going to tell me something that I disagree with, I need to be able to disagree and challenge the idea, but not you. I shouldn't be bringing any personal components of you into this place. Oh, well, you just think that because you're et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? That's the person. How do we challenge the idea, but not the person? And help the students, ask the students that. What does that look like? How do we do that? And have them help you write out those pieces, right? Because if you're just that top-down authoritarian voice, there's some benefits to that, but you want to bring in the other pieces where the students have the buy-in and the students remember, yes, okay, we were on board, we were a part of this. A couple more samples of that. Teaching tolerance has the Citizenship Contract. So again, you're looking through those different things, different classroom rules on the right-hand side, listening to respect, et cetera, et cetera. So again, you can Google these, you can look these up. I've given you some different resource pieces. So you're gonna wanna bring those key components to the class. And the idea is that we have to give them a chance, right? Like anything else, students need to practice getting better at this to help them make reasoned arguments. And again, that's why I like the structured academic controversy, where we have that component of the evidence, right? Here's the reasons behind it. Here's the evidence I'm bringing to the table. I'm not yelling, I'm not shouting. I'm not telling you about something I think I read somewhere or heard somewhere. I'm trying to structure in those facts, and then we're working around that. And there are different lesson plans, again, cited here as well. Teaching Tolerance has a lesson plan. Facing History has a lesson plan. Larry Ferlazzo, who does a lot of blogging and compiling of lists, he's got some resources in there as well. Because there is a lot of things out there for you to already pull from. And here's some of those things I've already referenced. From Teaching Tolerance and Facing History and Ourselves, the Speak Up for Civility contracts, the Civil Discourse, the Speak Up at School. All these pieces are out here. If you just look around, you can kind of see, oh yes, here's how to do it. So again, I strongly encourage you, do not use this as an opportunity to shy away from these pieces. Because I think when we shy away from those pieces, we're setting kids up to get into different structures of environments. And I don't ever want to say the real world, because if kids are in elementary or middle school right now and they have access to social media, they're already in that real world. They're already hearing these things. But when they leave these confines or the structures of your classroom, they're going to go into places where people aren't going to time them, tell them okay to stop, not refer them back to a classroom contract. And so we do need them to practice along the way so that when all those other things are off, they do have some of those skills built up. So there's more links to other resources in there. Thank you for listening and watching. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me or access the links in the resource. Again, thank you for listening and have a wonderful day.